What would you say if I told you that there was a game called Tetris 2? How about if I said that it plays nothing like Tetris, or if I told you that it was actually the 7th Tetris game? You're probably pretty confused, and that's totally understandable. Over 50 official Tetris games have been released since the one that started it all 3 decades ago, and needless to say, some of them get pretty weird. From games like Hatris to the fittingly named Tetrisphere, even to a Tetris game that monitored your heart rate in the 1990s, this franchise has gone through more strange variations than you would ever expect. I mean, come on, there's even a Tetris Battle Royale game now. How much weirder can Tetris get? Well, I mean, this thing exists, so apparently a good amount weirder. Join me in today's video as I take a chronological look at some of the strangest Tetris games to ever be released. The first Tetris sequel to hit the market was Wordtris, originally released for computers in 1989. Made by the original creator of Tetris, Alexei Pajitnov, Wordtris takes the core concept of Tetris and expands it into 3 dimensions. Well, kind of. The pieces themselves are still 2-dimensional shapes, but they'll fall down a 3-dimensional well represented by the grid on the screen. You can move these pieces along any of the 4 walls as they're falling to the well's bottom, with your goal being to clear lines either vertically or horizontally across that bottom. Once a piece reaches the well's floor, it'll fall as far as it can to the opposite side of the floor before coming to a stop. For example, if you drop a piece from the left wall, it will continue falling across the floor towards the right side until it either hits the right wall or any pieces that are in its way. This also means that when you clear a line, the remaining blocks will smash together in their attempt to follow this well's rather odd gravity. Needless to say, this takes a bit of getting used to, even with the grid guiding you along the walls. The top-down perspective messed me up more than I expected at first, and I had to keep reminding myself to double-check before I dropped a piece. Once you're used to it though, the game is surprisingly fun, although it won't last nearly as long as a game of regular Tetris without a lot more practice thanks to the floor's small size. If any of the piece you're dropping can't fit on the floor and it remains stuck on the wall, that wall will flash red and become unusable for a few drops afterwards. When all 4 walls are blocked at once, it's game over. Wordtris is certainly no Tetris, but it surprised me with how fun it was once you get used to the iffy controls. With the default keyboard settings, the game sort of gets caught when you're on the corner between 2 walls. Let's say you're trying to move from the left wall to the top, for example. It expects you to press up one more time when you're stuck on the corner, even though you would expect to start pressing right to move it across that top wall. With the alternate control scheme, it's just left and right the entire time, and that was far better for me. And the last thing that I'll say about Wordtris is that when you play on one of the higher difficulties, the game also introduces pentaminos to the series. These disgusting 5-block pieces that will ruin your day. Seriously, just looking at them makes me feel dirty. They look so wrong and disgusting and ugly and ugh, that's a sin. Following Wordtris was Pajitnov's 3rd major game release, Faces, also marketed as Faces ... Tris 3. Putting aside the fact that Faces ... Tris 3 might be the worst title for any game I've ever seen, this is also the worst Tetris game that I have ever played. In this game, 2 blocks fall simultaneously down a 5-column track, with each block featuring a piece of a face. These may be the chin, mouth, nose, eyes, or the top of the head, and there are several different faces that will appear in each level. These faces can range from famous figures like Einstein to holiday characters like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. You don't need to make a perfect face using only one set of features, and in fact, most of the time, that may as well be impossible. Instead, you'll Frankenstein together some often nightmare-inducing combinations of different people's noses, eyes, and so on. Now, all of this by itself would almost be okay if not for the game's crippling controls and flat-out bad mechanics. The 2 blocks will always initially fall into the 2nd and 4th columns, and there's no way to freely move them independently of one another or flip the blocks with one another. If you want the face piece on the left to fall into the 4th column, too bad, because the furthest it's ever gonna go is the middle column. That means that no matter what, you'll have incredibly limited lateral movement. The only exception to this is that if you can place one of the 2 blocks, the other then has free movement for the rest of its fall, but that's incredibly situational and rarely all that helpful. When the game likes to only drop noses and you really need a mouth to progress, you're essentially forced to create 2 garbage columns dedicated to the pieces that you can't use. See, if you place the wrong chunk of a face in the wrong order, that block becomes an unmovable garbage block that ruins the entire face that you were just making. Even better, there's no way whatsoever to remove garbage blocks or the failed faces, so when you make a mistake, it's permanent. If you can flip the blocks around, the game's manual sure as hell doesn't tell you how, and that alone would have gone a long way towards saving this game. You can spin the blocks around to see what face is on the other side of each, but more often than not, it's the same part of the face. A chin block is a chin all the way around, a nose block is usually a nose, etc. It's infuriating when you have exactly the piece that you need, but it's on the wrong side of the level. If you could freely control both blocks, or if they weren't forced to have that gap between them, or if you could swap between both blocks, or even if you could remove the garbage blocks somehow, I could almost excuse any one of these mistakes and look past it, but they tripped at every single step. I cannot understand how a sequel to a game entirely based around spinning and freely manipulating pieces as they fall completely ignored both of those mechanics. Released in 1990 around the same time as Faces, and later released on the NES and Game Boy, Hatris marks Pajitnov's fourth and final venture into the Tetris franchise. Thankfully, Hatris pretty much immediately addresses the issues that I had with Faces, and it's way more fun than I had ever expected. In Hatris, you are fittingly playing as two guys who work in a hat factory. In your capitalist quest to make the most money, you'll be stacking groups of 5 identical hats before sending them further down the conveyor belt to be boxed and sold. As the game progresses, you'll start stacking more variants of hat, the hats will drop faster, you know, the usual puzzle game stuff. Like in Faces before it, you'll be controlling 2 dropping hats at once, but unlike Faces, they're next to one another, and that makes things so much easier to control. Even better, you can swap their placement around with the press of a button. Thank you! Hatris also adds another 6th column for players to work with, and 1 special ability each for the 2 workers, which can be used when their special meter fills up. The worker on the lower right will pause the game and can swap 2 stacks of hats around, giving you the opportunity to take a breath and reposition a bit. The guy on the top left will slide down and throw up to 5 hats out from the bottom of a stack. That means that if you had to split up a stack of top hats with a baseball cap, for example, you can keep that game going for longer by throwing some of those mistakes away. Speaking of stacks, these specials can also be stacked, and in between levels you can choose to sell them to increase your cash score or save them for later. After making enough stacks of hats, your workday is over and you'll finish the level. After finishing enough levels, you'll move into a more difficult hat shop, which starts you off with more hats already in play. The only complaints I really have here are that at first glance the icons for each special look a little bit too similar with the same hair color, and that you can't choose which special to use if you have at least 1 from each worker. These didn't distract me for more than a moment when I was playing though. Hatris remains just simple enough to capture that original addictive magic of Tetris while totally fixing everything that made Faces as rough as it is and sprinkling in a little bit of its own unique charm as well. I really like this one. If you're at all curious about it, try it out. Okay, I'm kind of cheating on this one because Wordtris isn't actually an official Tetris game, but this'll be a short one and it's weird enough that I had to mention it. Hitting store shelves for the Super Nintendo, Game Boy, and PCs in 1991, Wordtris is exactly what it sounds like, a puzzle game where you've gotta make words. More specifically, your goal is to make words of 3 or more letters either vertically or horizontally by using these letter blocks that fall from the top of the screen. You know, like you'd hopefully expect from any game with the word tris in the title by now. Wordtris. That was an accident. I hate myself. While you'll start out by making words just on the top row, eventually you'll start having to place letters on top of one another and watch as they sink below the surface of what I'm gonna call the word ocean. It's really neat to see the game even recognize the words that you just so happen to accidentally make deeper down in the word ocean while trying to make other words on the surface, and the concept itself is just awesome to experience. It's not exactly awesome to play though. Naturally, the slipping point with a game like this is that some words that you would think should count aren't recognized. For example, I expected K to work and the Wordtris gods disagreed, but that's not a huge deal. The really big problem with Wordtris is that the vowels are way too rare. If this were Scrabble, you would think that Z's, X's, and J's are worth 3 points because they drop so damn frequently. Meanwhile, A's, O's, and E's may as well be 10-point letters, and this, of course, makes it incredibly difficult to keep making words. On the higher difficulties, where the game wants you to make longer words, you may as well forget it entirely. I would say the bomb blocks help make it easier, but really they only blow up a single letter, not the entire column you drop them on. And even then, they're just about as common as the question mark blocks, which will only reveal the letter inside when they land. That block really just drives a hole in your entire strategy, and in my experience, it was usually another difficult letter to work with. Wordtris is an exceptionally neat idea, but there was just no easy way to make the game work all that well. Here we are, several games later, it's time for the big one. Yes, we're finally at Tetris 2. Even if you count none of the previous games as real Tetris sequels, Tetris 2 still isn't the second Tetris game. There were a couple other official Tetris games in between the original and this 1993 sequel. In fact, Japan even got its own Tetris 2 that never made it to the West, and there was even a third Tetris 2 that came out on PC in 1996 after Japan got its own Tetris 3. God, my brain hurts. At least those games were actually Tetris though. This Tetris 2 is just Dr. Mario. You'll match falling Tetraminos up with a number of target blocks of different colors. As you'd expect from a Dr. Mario clone, the block colors are exclusively blue, yellow, and red. Although on the surface these two games seem exactly the same, the Tetramino shapes really add a difficulty spike compared to Mario's flat pills. In addition to your regular run-of-the-mill Tetramino shapes, there are a few new ones, and even some that will break apart upon landing. To make up for the higher level of challenge from these Tetramino blocks, you only need to match up 3 of one color in order to clear a line, and there's one more gameplay change here as well. In every level, one target block of each color will flash. If you clear this block, every single other block in that same color will disappear immediately, saving you a ton of time and effort. These might often be hiding near the bottom of the screen, but if you can maneuver your falling pieces just right, it's beyond satisfying to take down an entire level in just a few quick moves. I'll admit I wasn't exactly great at this one. As a seasoned Tetris and Dr. Mario player, combining the two like this took some getting used to. Plus, each segment of a Tetramino being its own color adds far more that you've got to keep in mind, more than you would expect at first for sure. It's still a pretty fun time, don't get me wrong, although if you don't like Dr. Mario, you're probably gonna like this one far less than regular Tetris. If you're still interested in trying it out though, I would recommend you play the Super Nintendo version that came out in 1994, featuring far better visuals and even some strange little cutscenes. Neat. Alright folks, it's time for Tetris to enter
the third dimension.
Again. You know, after Wordtris. Well, even then there were a couple 3-dimensional Tetris games for Nintendo's failed Virtual Boy system. You know what, whatever, it's time for Tetris to re-enter
the third dimension.
With possibly the weirdest game yet. Tetrisphere, released in August 1997, was the first of 4 Tetris games released in a 2-year span for the N64. It's kinda weird when you think about it that Tetris made up 10% of the Virtual Boy's library by itself, and over 1% of the N64's total game library, but I'm gonna look past that because the N64 Tetris games are also like 20% of this video, so I really can't judge. Tetrisphere, in addition to having maybe the most 90s soundtrack of all time, is pretty much not at all a Tetris game. Sure, it's got the Tetramino shapes and everything, but that's really the only point of similarity. This game plays across a spherical world made up entirely of these Tetramino shapes. Rather than clearing lines the traditional way, the player clears chunks of the world itself by lining up at least 3 of the same piece type during a drop. In this game, a drop can either be your own piece that you're dropping in place, or the cascading drops of other blocks as you clear other lines. The pieces can line up vertically, horizontally, or even in an L shape, but they have to line up exactly. One being even a single block off is a big no-no. If you drop a block without clearing a line, you'll lose one of your 3 lives, and if you lose all 3, it's obviously game over. Tetrisphere helps you avoid those game overs by giving you the unique ability to grab and move blocks around to help you set up new chains. For example, as you're clearing a line, you could grab the starter block in a chain as it's glowing and move it to start another line clear. There's a lot of really cool strategy in this game. Trust me, you'll need that strategy too if you want to play against the computer, because at first they wiped the floor with me. For a while, I ended up sticking to this game's single-player modes, which are incredibly fun. Just make sure you play the entire tutorial first. It's pretty short, and you're gonna need it to understand how this game works. Plus, if you do, you'll get to see one of the robots don a little graduation cap. Look at him, that's adorable. The single-player offerings are split into 3 modes: Rescue, Hide and Seek, and Puzzle. The first 2 of these modes have the same objective, saving these little robots from the inner core of the Tetrispheres by opening a path out. In Rescue, you've just gotta break open a large enough hole out of which these robots can escape. Meanwhile, Hide and Seek adds a bunch of neat little objectives to the mix, such as finding pictures at the center of the sphere, breaking a hole in certain spots, and a few others. Both of these modes have a level progression that builds in difficulty as you save more of the robots, and they each individually let you save and resume from any level. On the other hand, Puzzle Mode is a much slower offering, challenging you to clear pre-arranged block sets in a certain number of drops and moves. These will make you think a little bit more, and they're a fun change of pace from the other faster-paced modes. It's just a bummer that these single-player modes are all pretty short, only taking a few hours in total. Despite it being so different from Tetris, I had a blast with this one, and pretty quickly I would say that Tetrisphere jumped up onto my list of favorite N64 games. Considering the N64 was one of my most beloved childhood systems, that's incredibly high praise. The game just has that it factor that kept me wanting to come back for more. And every time I've done so thus far, I've found even more depth hiding under the surface. And again, that soundtrack is just 100% 90s. Mwah. About 15 months after Tetrisphere came Japan's exclusive Tetris 64. Interestingly enough, the game's text is almost entirely written in English, meaning that this is one of the best Japanese N64 games to import. Tetris 64 is pretty normal looking on the surface, but once I dove deeper, I found that this one was so crazy that I had to import it just to show it off. Tetris 64 is the only game ever made that uses the N64 biosensor, a peripheral that attaches to the expansion slot of your N64 controller. Then you attach this sensor to your ear and it allegedly measures your heart rate for the game's Bio-Tetris mode. But what is Bio-Tetris? Honestly, I wasn't entirely sure at first. I initially thought that as you played, the sensor would tie the game's speed to your heart rate. When you're calmer, the game would move slower. When your heart is pumping more, it would move faster. In practice, however, I saw absolutely zero change, even when I intentionally sped up my heartbeat by breathing heavily or by holding my breath entirely. Pretty much every English source I found on the web came to the same conclusion. This thing just didn't work. But hey, at least it makes for some cool jewelry. Oh God, get him away! After doing some deep digging, I found the actual function of the biosensor. The slower your heart rate, the more you'll obtain smaller pieces, making the game easier on you. The faster your heart rate, the more likely you are to suffer a fate worse than death. God, these things are disgusting. After going back to double check, I can confirm that this actually does work. It's just about as well explained as you'd expect from an unknown Japanese exclusive game. This also explains the normal and reverse modes exclusive to Bio-Tetris in the options menu. In reverse, a higher heart rate makes the game easier by giving you smaller blocks. Essentially, play the game in reverse and just keep doing squats. The pieces will get small and you'll get thick. Bio-Tetris isn't the only thing that makes this game stand out though, as there are a few other available game modes. Giga Tetris drops massive, oversized tetraminos that will break into smaller blocks when a line is cleared. There are also regular-sized blocks in this mode as well, making it a total mess. The different sized pieces just don't line up well whatsoever. There's also Familus, which is just Japan's name for the 4-player head-to-head mode. Fun fact, Tetris 64 is only the second Tetris game to include a 4-player option after its also Japanese exclusive predecessor, Super Tetris 3. When you really look at it, Tetris 64 doesn't do all that much to stand out from the other 3 Tetris games that are on the system, but if nothing else, the biosensor is a really neat novelty item. Jumping ahead a whopping 20 years, Tetris Effect is a game that I've already talked about in 2 previous videos just this year. Not only was it one of my favorite games from 2018, it's the catalyst behind this video. If not for Tetris Effect, I wouldn't have fallen in love with the series all over again. Designed in part by Tetsuya Mizuguchi, the mind behind synesthetic games like Rez, Tetris Effect aims to turn this simple puzzler into a sensory experience. Every level in the game's journey mode is musically charged, with the fall speed being determined by the tempo of the song behind it. Spinning and moving your pieces plays into that very theme with unique notes that make the very act of playing Tetris its own musical instrument. And these songs, made specifically for Tetris Effect, are nothing if not beautiful. Featuring dozens of different locations, from the loneliness of the moon to the busy streets of New York, each one draws a different emotion out of you. All of these emotions are magnified when you play Tetris Effect in virtual reality, and you feel yourself physically drawn into the puzzle. The haptic feedback of the controller with every beat and every button press, the surround sound VR headphones amplifying every single note, and the very board, Tetris's one symbol of unchanging strength, shifting around both with your head's movement and by itself to influence that very same movement, it all combines to make what might just be the single greatest Tetris game ever made. And I haven't even talked about the game's relax and focus modes, the new zone ability that lets you freeze time to catch your breath and clear up to 16 lines all at once in an ultra extreme quadruple Tetris turbo combo, the weekend challenges, and so many other features. Tetris Effect has a steep price at $40, but it's also an unforgettable time that will leave you amazed that this is the same simple game concept that took the world by storm over 30 years ago. And here we end on the newest Tetris game so far, and definitely one of the strangest. Not a few weeks before Tetris 99's surprise reveal, my buddies and I were joking about a Tetris Battle Royale, but we never actually thought we'd see it happen, let alone exclusively on a Nintendo system. In addition to putting new meaning to the phrase, "where we droppin' boys," Tetris 99 puts you against 98 other players in real time as you all jockey to see who truly is the king of the block. Despite releasing almost exactly 99 days apart, Tetris Effect and Tetris 99 couldn't be any more different from one another. Where Tetris Effect was intended as a solo experience, and often a calming one, 99 is the most hectic Tetris imaginable. Not only do you have to keep up with the game as it progresses, speeding up once as you hit 50 players, and speeding up even more when you reach the top 10, you've got to constantly battle with the garbage lines that one or multiple other players will throw at you when they make their own lines. On the left side of your screen, you'll get a warning of how many garbage lines are coming your way, and you have a few seconds to try and whittle them down by clearing lines of your own. When you get hit with 12 or more garbage lines in a row though, you're gonna feel the pain no matter how many lines you can clear. And then on top of all that, you've got to make sure that you're giving some garbage lines to other players as well. Using the left stick, you can target any random player in the game by moving the on-screen cursor to that player's miniature board. Alternatively, by using the right stick, you can choose to let the game target a random player, the player closest to being knocked out, the player who's knocked out the most other players, or the players that are currently targeting you. That's easier said than done though when you're trying to focus on keeping your board as pristine as possible. One quick movement of the stick to shift your target could lead to a mistake, and one mistake can genuinely spell doom for your entire run. Of course, if you're not great at speed Tetris, you're probably not winning anyway unless you get really lucky, because that final 10 is just ridiculous. I've made it to the top 2 a few times, but the only time I won was because I kept T-spinning one piece in place hoping the other player would fail before I did. Wait a second, that knockout logo is identical to the O in my logo! Where's my royalties, Nintendo? You've also got to decide what kind of player you want to be. Do you want to focus on kills and risk being targeted as the kill leader later in the game? Do you want to fly under the radar until the top 10 and hope you're not targeted by other players? Are you going to go only for small single and double line clears, or are you going to slam down with a double Tetris and destroy your foes in an instant? Tetris has obviously always had a lot of strategy to it, but that's never been clearer than when you're head to head. 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 And that, folks, is where we're going to end off for now. There were a bunch of other Tetris games that I could have explored as well, including Tetris World sitting right behind me, but this video encompasses the weirdest of the weird. And if you liked that weird, make sure you hit the like button and let me know down in the comments below. And if you want to see more content like this, make sure you subscribe as well. As always, everybody, stay golden.